Good evening from St. Peter's in Hope once again. Welcome to this next step through St. Mark's Passion account. I find that after last night, I'm not quite finished with the passage I was considering yesterday. And there's only one word that really sticks, and it's this. They had Jesus bound, that's the chief priests, etc., and took him away and handed him over to Pilate. Now, it's that word, handed him over to Pilate, and it's that verb, handed him over. Now, to hand over somebody can be quite innocent in English, but it can also be understood into to betray. And in fact, traitor, the person who is the betrayer, is the hander over in the original account. So when Jesus says, my betrayer is close at hand, the person who's going to hand me over is close at hand. So what we have here is Judas hands Jesus over to the chief priests. The chief priests and the Sanhedrin hand Jesus over to Pilate. Then later we find, in certain accounts, Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified. Now, this verb it's a very troubling verb. It brings to mind this question: who was responsible for the death of Jesus? Well, in the second Eucharistic prayer here, we've got it in our little Sunday Missal, if I can find it. In the second Eucharistic prayer, we say, on the night he was handed over, on the night he was betrayed, he took bread, etc. But it says also, he willingly gave himself up to death. So the person who hands over Jesus is Jesus himself. Jesus is in control of the process. That is extremely important. Now, it's not that Jesus is he's the innocent victim for our redemption, and a victim is a rather passive person, we think. But this victim actively hands himself over. And as it says here in the second Eucharistic prayer, which I've just found, for our sake, he opened his arms on the cross. This is the old translation. Before he was given up to death, a death he freely accepted. In qua nocte tradebatur, in that night on which he was handed over, a death he freely accepted. He was given up to death, but he freely accepted it. Okay, but this does not absolve the people who handed him over from responsibility and from guilt. Because with responsibility goes guilt. Who is the most guilty? Well, it's obvious that the person who's most responsible for the death of Jesus is the man who signed his death warrant, and that would have been Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate is the one who took up his stylus and wrote it down, and therefore the people who crucified Jesus were just doing what the written orders they had from Pontius Pilate told them to do. So Pontius Pilate is the most guilty. Also, it's important to notice that Pontius Pilate was the most guilty because he really was making what's called an unforced error. He didn't have to do this. He knew it was wrong. He, after all, was well versed in Roman law and in the administration of Roman law, and he knew that this was a travesty. Therefore, he's particularly guilty because he was taking the easy way out, and he could easily have dismissed the case and set Jesus free. But because he was self-serving, he saw it as in his interest to have Jesus condemned to death. He sacrificed Jesus. He wouldn't sacrifice his own interests. Now, the people who handed Jesus over to Pontius Pilate, wanting Pontius Pilate to kill him judicially, and knowing that this would be the outcome, they're also guilty. That means the Sanhedrin. They were guilty as well. And then if we go back in the chain of handing over, Judas, when he handed Jesus over to the Sanhedrin, clearly did not have anything good in mind. He knew the outcome as well, or so we think. He said, take the one I kiss, take him in charge. Don't just take him along for questioning. No, make sure you seize him, make sure you tie him up, etc. Judas had no good intentions, therefore he is to blame. Now, this blame game, as we call it in English, is very interesting when we read St. Mark's Gospel, but also the other Gospels, because for the readers of the Gospel in the early years, the idea that the Romans would have been responsible for the death of Jesus was very problematic. Because you see, the Roman Empire was just so wonderful for them. They were all living in the Pax Romana. They were all enjoying the benefits of the Roman Empire, and the administration of Roman law. And therefore, for them, the idea that the state that they adhered to was corrupt and crucified innocent people was anathema. And therefore, while Pontius Pilate, he was weak, not guilty, he was just weak. And that, therefore, transfers the guilt back to the people who handed him over to Pontius Pilate, namely the Sanhedrin. Therefore, you get the idea that it was Jesus' own people who condemned him to death and were responsible for his death, rather than nice Romans, because, we all like Romans, don't we? Whereas, of course, the Jews were foreigners. What could you expect? So it panders to the prejudices of the early reader. And, of course, there was also a very important piece of reasoning in the evangelist's mind. We don't want to paint Jesus as a criminal. And of course, there you've got a very big problem. Obviously, Jesus is not a criminal, but to the early people, well, if he was crucified by the Romans, he must have been a criminal, because the Romans don't crucify innocent men. That would be a very, very strong prejudice in the mind. Prejudgment, prejudice, that's what it means. So the evangelists, in order to present Jesus as an innocent man, have to shift the blame onto the Sanhedrin, because the Sanhedrin, of course, would crucify an innocent man. And of course, by the time this gospel was written, the Sanhedrin no longer existed, because the temple had been destroyed and the land of Israel had been cleared of its Jewish inhabitants. So there we see the political workings in the mind of the first the first people to write this down. We must shift the blame from the Romans onto the people who aren't here to defend themselves, namely the Sanhedrin. I've gone on too long, almost 7 minutes. Thanks for listening so far. See you tomorrow. Bye.